Welcome to the New England Football Show. I'm John Serenitas, and as always, I'm joined by my partner, Kevin Stone. And tonight we have a special guest joining the show. Zack Cox from NESN is joining us tonight. Gentlemen, how are you this evening?
Doing good, John. How you doing?
Good.
Doing great, guys. Thanks for having me.
Well, Zack, thank you for taking the time. And I do want to, tell our listeners tonight that you and I go back a ways. Back in 2006, I coached at King Philip when you were a receiver and a defensive back. And so we go back a ways. I also coached your brother. So obviously, there's a lot of familiarity there. But let's just jump right into it. You've been on the Patriots beat now for 6 years. You obviously are well connected to the team. First of all, what are your thoughts on Bill Belichick going big game hunting here? He actually shopped. He didn't shop in the bargain bin. He actually shopped for real players. Just your overall thoughts on what was a crazy week last week in Foxborough, Zack.
Yeah, and first off, it's crazy to think how long ago that actually was when you were coaching me back at KP. What was you said 2006? So that I don't even want to do the math on how long ago that was.
15 years ago, my friend. I'll do it for you.
Oh my God, that's tough to think about. But yeah, no, excuse me. I was honestly pretty surprised with how the Patriots have handled the last 7 days, really. You knew with all the cap space they had and all the needs that they had, it wasn't going to be the standard type of Patriots offseason. You knew they had to go out and get a big name or two. I mean, I was expecting probably something similar to 2017 when they went out and got Stephon Gilmore. They got Brandon Cooks. They had more of a spend-free offseason than they typically have. But just to see them come out of the gate the way they did last week with Jonnu Smith, and then it was Gotcha, and then it was Judon, and then I think it was 9 or 7 players within the first 8 hours. And then they come and add Hunter Henry the next day. Then Kyle Van Noy comes back. Ted Karras comes back. It's been pretty remarkable to see the way that Bill Belichick has handled everything this past week. And I mean, you can go off the quotes that Robert Kraft gave to a couple outlets this morning. It was basically the team saying, yeah, we don't want to finish 7-9 again, and we have the money to do it, so we're going to go out and do it. I mean, I think they've personally been making mostly the correct moves here. Obviously, it's history suggests that doing this isn't really the best way to build a team. You don't usually see the teams that quote unquote win free agency come out and actually have successful seasons or playoff seasons the following year. But also most of those teams don't have Bill Belichick. They don't have the infrastructure that the Patriots have. So it's going to be fascinating to see what this roster turns out looking like this year.
Zack, my first question is, before free agency, I thought for sure when the draft came along that they would be going defense. Now I have absolutely no idea. Does this kind of sway you, one way or another, or is it just, anyone's guessing game right now?
Well, they've basically filled every need or almost every need that they had. If you look down that offseason checklist, it's tight end, it's wide receiver, it's defensive tackle, it's edge rusher, it's linebacker. They've filled all of those. I mean, they still need they probably still need to get a running back in there at some point, but it's some minor needs, some very, very low level needs that are remaining on that list, which kind of gives them the flexibility to really do whatever they want in that first round. And I personally think it would be worthwhile for them to attempt to trade up into the top 10 and get one of those top quarterbacks. I mean, they're not going to be in this situation again, they hope, for a long time, where they have the 15th overall pick and they don't have many other needs that they really need to plug. So I think if as long as they like one of those two guys, or one of those probably 3 or 4 guys that might be available in that range, they're not going to get Trevor Lawrence. They're probably not going to get Zach Wilson. But I think Justin Fields or Trey Lance would be a really good fit, especially with Cam Newton coming back. Both of those players, similar players to Cam, similar skill sets. Especially with Lance, probably not ready to play right away, could use some time to sort of be groomed behind a quarterback for at least that first season. I think both of those situations would work out pretty perfectly for the Patriots on paper, at least. It all comes down to whether the Patriots agree in their evaluation with that, and whether they'd be willing to part ways with whatever capital it would take to move up to whatever you want to call it, 6, 7, 8, 9, to get a guy in that range. But I think that would be a smart move for the Patriots, just with the way their roster looks right now, the way their future outlook looks, I think moving up for a quarterback would be a smart move.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Zach. And of course, we all know Bill Belichick's history. He has never drafted a quarterback with a top 60 pick. But you bring up a great point that they filled a lot of their needs last week. And so now what it comes down to is, does he feel enticed enough to move into the top 10 and position himself to make a run at either a Trey Lance or a Justin Fields? Because I don't think you're going to need to necessarily trade into the top 10 for Mac Jones, although you never know. But those two guys I do think will go in the top 10. Realistically speaking, do you think that internally they feel the way we do, that, you know what, this might be their best chance in the next 3 to 5 years to get that franchise type quarterback? And hey, let's maybe offer Atlanta at 4 or Detroit at 7 and see if we can get into the top 10. Do you think internally they're having that conversation?
I think they have to be, just with, if you look at the whole landscape. I mean, you look at their own roster. Cam's under contract for 1 season. It's basically he's basically guaranteed $3.5 million. So if Cam Newton doesn't even make the team this offseason, which I do expect to happen, but if he doesn't make the team, the Patriots can even cut him this offseason relatively easily. They really have no current long-term plan at quarterback on their roster. And as I mentioned before, them having the 15th overall pick, this being a really, really strong quarterback class, at least according to what all the draft analysts and all the guys that have been following these guys very closely think. I mean, it's been years since we were even talking about 5 quarterbacks potentially going in the top 10, and that 5 quarterbacks in the top 15 has only happened once in NFL history, I believe. So this is a particularly strong class. The Patriots have the need there. They have the assets to get into that range without totally blowing up their draft board for the next 2 or 3 years. So, I mean, only Bill Belichick and the people inside that building really know how they view this whole situation. But to me, it looks like a pretty, if not obvious, at least it would be a situation that would make a lot of sense for sure.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And I think it's one of those things that, look, we know, realistically speaking, that when you look at the situation that they're in right now, this is their best opportunity to address that position. When you look ahead to 2022, that quarterback class is not going to be as good at the top as this one is. I think it's a deeper class. I think there's going to be more available talent. But I don't think that they can trade down or pass up on the opportunity. Now, with Belichick, he is an enigma when it comes to the draft and is the ultimate wild card, so who knows? But I think people around here are so conditioned to them trading down that I think if they ever made a trade up, whether it be at 4 with Atlanta or with Detroit or maybe Philadelphia at 6, if they traded into the top 10, I think it would be seismic, on par with what happened here last week. Because, again, we're not used to seeing that. And I think it would send a clear message to this fan base that, hey, not only did we spend to win now, but now we're investing in the most important position in sports long term.
No, I totally agree. And would it surprise me if the Patriots kind of addressed some other needs and then drafted Kellen Mond in the 3rd round? No, not really. I mean, that would be a very Patriots type move. But yeah, I think Bill Belichick knows how important the quarterback position is and how important it is to have some sort of plan at that position, some sort of future plan. I think that's something that the Patriots didn't really have after the whole Jimmy Garoppolo thing, and it ended up sort of biting them once Tom Brady departed and he wasn't in the picture anymore. And back to the sort of Bill Belichick draft tendency type thing, he has never drafted a quarterback in the top 60, but he hasn't really needed to. I mean, when you have Tom Brady for so many of those years, you don't need to trade up into the 1st round to draft a quarterback at number 15 or number 20 or wherever it may be. They had that luxury to be able to devote those resources elsewhere. Now they don't, and now they have a lot of those holes, as I was mentioning earlier, have been filled. So there's not a glaring need in there. Again, there are still a couple of different ways that they could go in this draft. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion by any means that they will go quarterback in that 1st round, but I just think with how it's all setting up on multiple fronts there, I do think that would make a lot of sense for the future of this team.
Zach, I want to talk about the offseason workouts that Stidham has kind of put together out west. Is there any shot that he gets a legitimate shot to be the guy, or is he just so far kind of off the radar right now that there's really no way?
I wouldn't say there's no way. I'd say he's definitely at a distinct disadvantage right now, just with how we saw the last season transpire, with how poorly the offense was performing, especially in the second half of the season, and especially in the passing game. There were several games where Cam Newton was benched. There were several games in the second half of the season where he threw for fewer than 100 yards. And you would have to think that if the Patriots had any sort of faith in Jarrett Stidham last season, he would have gotten a start at some point toward the end of the year. Because I know a lot of us in the media were arguing for it, saying, what's the harm at this point? I mean, even in week 17, the Patriots are out of playoff contention. Don't you at least want to see how this guy looks in a game situation? Which is kind of one of the reasons why it's still sort of difficult to evaluate Jarrett Stidham, because he's never started a game at the NFL level. All of his action, or basically all of his action, has come in games that have already been decided. He's had very few opportunities with the first team during the season to practice. He's been almost exclusively with the scout team. So it's hard to say, oh yeah, this guy has no chance and is not an NFL quarterback just because we haven't seen it yet. But the fact that he hasn't gotten even an opportunity to do that yet, I think sort of speaks to how the Patriots view him now. But I mean, it is interesting that he's going out and planning these workouts. I think that shows me that he still believes he has a chance of competing for this starting job. I don't think that's something that a guy who was sort of resigned to being a backup would do. How realistic his chance is, that remains to be seen. I mean, I don't think it's Cam Newton's job guaranteed by any means this summer. But I think just with what we've seen over the last year, it would be pretty surprising to me if Stidham did come out and earn that job this summer.
Speaking of surprising, Zach, were you surprised that they re-signed Cam Newton? Because it seemed at the end of last season that it was a foregone conclusion that he was gone.
I did think it was a foregone conclusion that he was gone at the end of the year. I thought that there was no way that they would bring him back, just with how sort of broken the offense looked by the end. But as the offseason went along, I think as it hit maybe mid or late February, right around the Matthew Stafford trade, my mindset was sort of shifting. Now, I still don't know if it was the best move for the team, but it makes a lot of sense, and you can pretty easily construct an argument for Cam Newton, for re-signing Cam Newton, saying, look, this guy, he signed 3 months into free agency last year. He was learning one of the most complex offenses in the NFL. He was throwing to a group of pass catchers that was probably the weakest in the NFL, if not one of the weakest. And then he had the whole COVID situation that sidelined him for 2 weeks and really threw him off his game and sort of scuttled any momentum rather that he was building earlier in the year. So there's a lot of things that you could say, look, Cam was just dealt a terrible hand last year. Give him another chance. He's not going to get worse as long as you fix the holes around him and he has a full offseason and all that. I mean, that being said, I did think Cam he struggled a lot on his own last year. I mean, independent of those other issues. But overall, I don't think it was a terrible decision to re-sign him. I think it was a good plan for the Patriots, for Bill Belichick, to have at least some quarterback in there for the start of free agency, at least a guy who was somewhat of a proven commodity, at least an experienced option. I think it would have been very dangerous going into that free agency period with just Jarrett Stidham and Jake Blagala as your only two quarterbacks on your depth chart, and having to convince free agent pass catchers and say, no, we've got a plan. Like, don't worry about it. We're going to figure it out as it goes. We're going to get a quarterback in here at some point, but we don't know exactly who it's going to be. Now, I mean, so even if Cam doesn't end up being the Patriots starter in week one, I do think it was a smart plan to at least get some stability at that position going into free agency.
Well, you know who wasn't happy with the re-signing was my partner here. He was not a fan. And listen, I think a lot of people, it caught people off guard because when you think back to last season, the number one thing you remember about him is that he looked washed up. Whether you thought he was or he wasn't is irrelevant. The arm strength just wasn't what it was when he was at Carolina. It didn't look like he was healthy from the shoulder injury he had suffered. But I think when you step back and you look at it objectively, and I agree with you, Zach, the arm thing is a concern. There's no question about that. But I don't think they could have gone into free agency with no quarterback? Because now all of a sudden, how do you convince a Nelson Aguilar to take your money, or a Kendrick Bourne, or even these tight ends? How do you convince Smith and Henry to take your money if there isn't a guy there? So I think you bring up a great point. If nothing else, he's a guy that has been a starter in this league for a long time. He has cachet. I know Patriot fans don't want to hear this, but he's pretty well respected around the league, and he was a beloved teammate in Carolina. I've talked to people there that loved him. So I think the Patriots know this. He has a grasp of their offense. So if they were going to go the veteran route in free agency, he made the most sense for them. And I think they really believe that internally. ANAS93 says Mac Jones at pick 15. Zach, do you see them standing pat? And if Jones is there, maybe taking him at 15?
I think Mac Jones is a possibility, especially with the whole Saban connection, the whole Alabama connection. I've never really been sold on him as a first-round talent. I just think watching him last year at Alabama, obviously had a phenomenal season, basically led the nation in a good number of categories, basically had statistically on par with the season that Joe Burrow had the year before. But I think there was a reason why that season made Joe Burrow the unquestioned number one pick, and this season still has people questioning whether Mac Jones is even a first-round talent. I just didn't see a lot of, I guess, wow plays from him last year. I know that sounds kind of shallow, but he played in such a talented offense that really all he had to do was, in a lot of cases, stand behind the college football's best offensive line and then throw the ball to Devontae Smith, hand the ball to Najee Harris. He just had so much talent around him, and with his relative lack of athleticism, it's hard to say whether he can have that same level of success in an offense at the NFL level that isn't that stacked with weapons. So I still think Mac Jones could be a good NFL quarterback. I think he is definitely somebody that will go in the early rounds and should go in the early rounds. But at pick number 15, I don't know. I still think that's a little bit high for him.
Yeah,
Jason Hogan is chiming in. Thank you for listening, Jason. What do you think the ceiling is for this team with an average to above average starter, Cam being below average? So what do you think the ceiling for this team is depending on what they do at quarterback in 2021?
I think that even currently constructed, even with Cam Newton, I think this is a team that can get back to the playoffs next season. I've thought that since really before last season even ended. You just look at all the cap space that they had, all the resources, and then all what they've turned that into, as I was saying before, just really plugging all of the holes that they had on this roster. Again, we'll see if Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne and guys like this are going to be the players that the Patriots want them to be, and are players that can actually fill those holes. But I'm pretty confident that this team can make it back to the playoffs next year. I mean, if you look at this roster on paper, it's kind of stunning that the Patriots went 7-9 last season, just with the deficiencies of talent that they had at so many different positions. And even if you look a little bit deeper at some of those games, if the Seattle game, the Buffalo game, even the Houston game, one or two others, they pull out a few of those, that's an 8-9 win team that's pushing for a playoff spot already. And I think, at least on paper, they are significantly better now, especially on the defensive side. So I think this is a playoff team this year. I'm not prepared to say that they'll be back into Super Bowl contention or anything like that, but I think if I was making my predictions right now, I would predict the Patriots will be back in the playoffs next year.
Zach, you mentioned the wide receivers, and do you think they're done at wide receiver? I mean, there's still, I know T.Y. is still out there, and again, they made a splash, but do you think they still need a little bit more?
I think they're probably done in terms of high end relative to whatever's out there right now. I guess if the prices keep going down on some of these guys, then maybe they could scoop up I don't know, a Sammy Watkins or a T.Y. Hilton or something like that. But I would be a little surprised if they got somebody on that level. Maybe they will get one of the lower level, maybe another Kendrick Bourne level guy or slightly even below that. And I also wouldn't be surprised if this is a position that they go after in the draft. Maybe not with a premier pick, but maybe on a day 2 or early day 3 type guy. Because I think they could still use a little bit more help there, especially with Julian Edelman. We really don't know at this point whether he is going to be with the team this season, whether he's going to be healthy enough to play. According to the latest reports, he is preparing as if he is going to play, but there's still a lot of uncertainty with that knee. And the fact that we're now basically 4-ish months out from the procedure he went through, maybe even longer than that, and it's still not a certainty whether he'll be ready or not. That's definitely a little bit dicey. And if you take Julian Edelman out of that, maybe take N'Keal Harry out of that, depending on whether he ends up getting traded. He's been mentioned in some trade rumors lately. I could definitely see them adding another piece to this receiving core, but I don't think it's going to be a big name that they would bring in.
Do you agree with what's out there, that these reports that they're shopping Harry? Would you move on from N'Keal Harry, or is it too early 2 years in to give up on a first-round pick like that?
I think I probably would. I just think a fresh start would probably be best for both sides in there. He just really hasn't. He didn't show a ton of progression and improvement, at least to me watching him last year. Now, obviously, there was the quarterback issues, and Cam Newton, as we were talking about earlier, did have some trouble actually getting his receivers the ball on occasion. But just overall, I don't think that N'Keal Harry has given the Patriots anywhere close to what they expected from him, drafting him in the first round. And obviously, it certainly doesn't help that there were about a dozen really, really good wide receivers that came off the board after him, in A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf, Terry McLaurin, all these guys. I mean, it's kind of beside the point on that. But yeah, I haven't seen much over these 2 seasons that makes me think that N'Keal Harry can perform to the level that the Patriots expect him to in this offense. I mean, you just look at his game log so far. He has 1 game in his career where he has at least 5 catches, 1 game in his career where he has at least 50 receiving yards, and those were both the same game, the Seattle game last season. And after that, he sort of plateaued and then got hurt and then was sort of up and down the rest of the way. So I don't know. I think if the Patriots can get any value for him at all, I think I would move on from him this offseason.
Yeah, and it's so hard because they have whiffed so badly at that position through the years. As great as Belichick is at coaching the team, and he's made some shrewd decisions in free agency in the draft during his tenure here, there's a lot of misses in that wide receiver room. And I think ultimately, if they end up moving on from him, he might be the biggest miss of all, because they invested a first-round pick in him. And Jason Hogan checks in again. Kwity Paye at 15. Michigan's Kwity Paye played at Bishop Hendrick in high school. That's well within his range. I'm not sure, though, that the Patriots are going to be interested in Paye, because I think Paye's a better fit, in my opinion at least, as a 4-3-5 technique defensive end. He can play in the 3-4, but I think he might be better in a scheme that will allow him to be a one-gap penetrator, get up the field and push the pocket and collapse it. Speaking of scheme, now, I thought the Matthew Judon signing was interesting, because when you look at what they did in free agency defensively, you add Godshaw, you add Judon, then they go and reacquire Kyle Van Noy. It seems to me like they might be transitioning back to a 3-4. Do you see that, or do you think it doesn't really matter with Belichick? These are guys that fit, and they're going to play them where they need to play them.
I could definitely see that. Obviously, with the Patriots, they're sort of malleable and flexible with whatever kind of scheme that they're doing. I thought it was interesting that Devon Godshaw was announced as a nose tackle when the Patriots acquired him. I know that's sort of a semantics type thing, but I know he did play a decent amount on the nose in Brian Flores' defense down there in Miami. And it'll be interesting to see how this entire group comes together this year, just because the Patriots front seven, it was kind of a mess last year. They really didn't have the depth and experience they needed on the defensive line. They were really shaky on the edges, both against the run and with their pass rush. And at the second level, I mean, Adrian Phillips was their best linebacker, and he is not a linebacker. So I think that rebuilding that front seven and obviously getting Dante Hightower back is really going to help that group, assuming he does end up coming back from that COVID opt-out. But I think that was an area that they really needed to improve and just add an influx of talent to. And I think that was sort of borne out by what they did in free agency. Basically, more than half of their signings so far were devoted to that front seven, and Judon and Van Noy and Godshaw and Anderson and Montavious Adams and Raekwon McMillan was the other linebacker they added. They're really trying to reshape this group, and then hopefully for them having Dante Hightower back in there, I think it could be a much more formidable defense than what the Patriots saw last season.
Zach, you mentioned Hightower, and is there a chance that if he's not, the guy they expect, he's either not here or they're going to ask him to take a pay cut?
I think the pay cut is always a possibility with Hightower. It seems like that's something that comes up every offseason. I know he hasn't been open to doing that in the past, and I think this year, I don't know whether those negotiations have started or whether they're going to start at some point, but I think he has a pretty good case to say, look at what you guys did without me last year. Like, you really need me in this defense, and I should be paid at the level that I am being paid. We'll see how all of that plays out, but I think having him back in there if he is even at the level where he was in 2019, where he was a Pro Bowler, I think that could potentially be one of the most significant additions / re-additions that the Patriots have made this offseason, because I just think that defense looks completely different when he's in there. And
real quick, as a follow-up to the front seven talk, Lawrence Guy, I think he went to Miami today for a visit. If he's not back here, is someone like Suh or someone else out there an option, or are they just going to try and fill it in-house?
I've always thought Ndamukong Suh would be an interesting addition for the Patriots. He's still a good player. He had something like 6 or 7 sacks last year. He was really disruptive for Tampa Bay. I think he still might end up making a little bit more money than they're going to want to devote to the fourth defensive tackle that they sign this offseason, because they already have made a lot of additions up front. But I do think they could use probably one more body in there, one more proven player, whether that is re-signing Lawrence Guy, which seems to become less and less likely by the day, or going out and getting one of the veterans remaining. But yeah, I mean, if Ndamukong Suh is willing to play for, I don't know, maybe a little bit less than he played for in Tampa Bay, he's getting up there. He's I think 34 years old. I think he'd definitely be worth a shot if the monies and the financials are right.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the signing of Anderson, I think Anderson's going to fill that Lawrence Guy slot. Yeah. He's going to be that 5 technique defensive end in their 30 fronts, and he can kick inside and play the 3 technique in their 40 fronts. Patrick Chung announced his retirement in a unique way at the end of last week, Zach. Talk a little bit about his career in New England and his achievements, and were you surprised that he decided to walk away?
Not really. I mean, I guess the fact that he did just sign a pretty long contract extension last offseason made it a little bit interesting. And the fact that there were reports that he was among the Patriots opt-outs who were planning to come back this season, I guess maybe it was a slight surprise, but I just think you look at where he is in age. He's 33 or going to be 33 this offseason. His body has taken an absolute beating over the year. It's just the position that he plays at, the size that he plays it at. It's one of the more physically demanding spots on the field. And I think that sort of finally started to catch up with him in his final season or two, where he just seemed to be dealing with constant injuries, and he played through a lot of those injuries. He's always been praised for his toughness over the years, but I think those finally started to pile up a little bit. And I think the Patriots are well positioned to replace him, both with the moves they made last offseason in getting or drafting Kyle Duggar, signing Adrian Phillips, and then going out and getting Jalen Mills last week from Philadelphia. Not sure exactly what role Mills is going to play yet. He was a cornerback earlier in his career, recently played some more safety, basically played all over the field for the Eagles, but I think he'll definitely take on some of those Chung responsibilities. But I think it's been interesting to see just the outpouring of support for Patrick Chung since he made this announcement last week. He's one of the most respected players on the Patriots. Duron Harmon called him one of the most underrated players of all time. And I think you just need to look at the statement that Bill Belichick released today. Belichick has always spoke highly of kind of great players that have come through here and played here for a long time. But some of the quotes that he had on Patrick Chung today, basically saying that he's the most versatile player he's ever coached. He essentially does everything right. He's one of the toughest players he's ever coached. It's clear that Belichick really, really respects Patrick Chung. And I think that's been pretty evident lately that he's not the only one that has that feeling. So I think replacing him will be difficult just because he plays so many roles. He's such a leader in that secondary. But I think the Patriots are in a good spot with the bodies that they currently have to sort of plug all those different holes that Patrick Chung would fill.
Zach, I want to kind of put you on the spot here a little bit. Of all the free agents that they've added, which one do you think potentially could have the biggest impact next season for them?
Well, I think they hope that it's one of their tight ends. I think Hunter Henry is a very, very good player. I think that he could end up having a big season for the Patriots next year. I think Jonnu Smith is maybe one whose stats will continue to be not overly impressive. I mean, if you look at the numbers he put up in Tennessee outside of the touchdowns early last year, you'd say, this is fine. This is standard production. But then you watch some of the things that he can do on tape, and he's a pretty impressive guy. He's a pretty athletic guy, can definitely block, can do a lot of things, can take handoffs out of the backfield. I think Hunter Henry will be the more productive of the two players, and I wouldn't be surprised if he is one of the top pass catchers in this Patriots offense next year. I think it's a bold prediction to say that they're going to be Gronk and Hernandez part 2, and I think they have that's a pretty lofty height, and I wouldn't be predicting that, but I do think that if both of those players perform even to the level that they've shown so far in their career, they can really reshape this Patriots offense, which it looks totally different when they have even an above average tight end. Even when Martellus Bennett was here in 2016, he played really well for them, and he really added an extra dimension to that offense. And then you've just seen over the last 2 years, obviously there's been talent issues elsewhere, especially at wide receiver, but there's just been a total black hole at tight end. And I think getting those two guys in there is really going to fix some of that.
Yeah, and we've been hearing, obviously, all week since they signed both of them last week about Bill Belichick's desire to play in 12 personnel a lot. And look, that interest in playing in 12 personnel goes all the way back to the 80s when he was a defensive coordinator of the Giants. Those Giants teams, of course, had Mark Bavaro and Zeke Mowat before he came to the Patriots and had the Lisa Olson situation, and Howard Cross. So, and then you fast forward to when he was in New England. Even though he didn't have elite level guys at the beginning part of the dynasty, he had productive guys in Daniel Graham, Jermaine Wiggins, Fourier, and then, of course, in 2010, they draft Gronkowski and Hernandez, and they kind of became the standard tight end duo in the league. And now the Patriots have an opportunity to use 12 personnel more. And 12 personnel is tough because you can create so many matchups in 12 personnel with 2 tight ends, 2 receivers, 1 back. And when you have 2 guys like Henry and Smith, just like Gronkowski and Hernandez, that have different skill sets. One can play the Y like Henry will, and one can play the U like Smith will. That really allows you to get the matchups you want, especially in the red zone. And I think you're going to see this Patriots passing game, at least that's our hope, that it's a lot more productive than it was last season. Jason checks in again. Gilmore, a holdout, traded, new contract. What do you think happens with Stephon Gilmore, Zach?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest question, except for maybe the quarterback situation, that still has to be answered for the Patriots this offseason. I think they would be smart to keep Stephon Gilmore. I think that he would certainly help this team this season, especially because we're not totally sure what's going to happen with J.C. Jackson either. I do think that there is a decent possibility that a team would be willing to give up a second-round pick to bring in J.C. Jackson on the kind of level of contract that they'd be able to get him for right now ahead of unrestricted free agency next year. I do think keeping Gilmore would be preferable, I'm sure, for the Patriots, but at the same time, I can't see him playing for the value that he has right now. I mean, his salary this season is right around $7 million plus another $500,000, and I think roster bonus. So it'd be basically $7.5 million, which is well below market value for a player of his caliber. Even if you say he's not the defensive player of the year anymore, he was still one of the better cornerbacks in the NFL when he was healthy last year. So yeah, I'm really interested to see how that situation plays out. I honestly don't have a great read on it right now. I can see it playing out either way. I think there's probably a better chance that they work something out contract wise and keep him here for another year or two. But also I don't know. I do feel like like Stephon Gilmore's been mentioned in trade rumors now for long enough, and it hasn't happened yet, and no team has seemingly been willing to give up what the Patriots kind of have pegged as his value. And he's also coming off the season-ending injury, which is a little bit of a concern there too. So I think if I had to pick, or if I had to make a prediction, I would say that they figure something out and he stays here, but that is by no means a certainty.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if he is traded, if he's included in a potential package to move up into the top 10. I mean, that is a possibility. One of the advantages they do have is that they have players that they can put in a compensation package to move into the top 10, whether it be Atlanta at 4 or Philly at 6 or Detroit at 7. Certainly Gilmore's name will be mentioned, N'Keal Harry, possibly Isaiah Wynn. They do have an interesting decision to make, speaking of Isaiah Wynn, when it comes to Sony Michel and Isaiah Wynn. Do you see them picking up their fifth-year options?
With Michel, I would say probably no. Just because we've seen over the years how replaceable running backs can be. And Sony Michel, he had a really good end to the season last year, but overall, I would say that he probably hasn't lived up to what the Patriots would want him to be as a first-round pick. Obviously, he was instrumental in that Super Bowl run his rookie year, so that he always does have to get credit for that. But I think overall, he hasn't been nearly as consistent as they would want somebody drafted in that spot to be. Wynn is a tougher case because when he's on the field, when he's healthy, he's good. He is a good left tackle. He is a left tackle that you want on your football team, but spent time on injured reserve all 3 of his seasons. He's basically missed half of his games since he entered the NFL. And that the 5th-year option locks in his salary for this year and then guarantees him right around $10 million for next year. So that is it's a decently sizable chunk of money for someone who to this point has not proven that he can stay healthy. I think, I guess if I had to make that prediction, I would say no on Michel and probably yes on Wynn at this point. But again, he's still a pretty big wild card just with the injury concerns. And I mean, there still is a possibility that he could even be moved to guard this season, depending on how the Patriots view Michael Wenu. I think the most likely scenario there is probably Wenu at left guard and Isaiah Wynn staying at left tackle. But I don't think that's totally set in stone either.
Zach, I before we go here, I did want to get into a little bit about next season in terms of the AFC East. Now, obviously, the Buffalo Bills, they won the division last year. I think the prevailing thought is that they're going to be the team to beat. Miami is obviously much improved, just missed out on the playoffs. Based on what the Patriots have done this offseason, have they put themselves back in position to contend for the AFC East? Because you made a great point earlier. Let's not talk Super Bowl contender. They certainly appear to be a playoff contender. But are they in position now where they could be one of the teams that can contend for the AFC East and push Buffalo? Because last year they played with them. They didn't in that second game, but they certainly could have won that first game. But do you think they've done enough where now we can definitively say, like we did all those years, that, you know what? Yes, they have a legitimate shot at winning this division.
I think so. Yeah. I think you would, if you're making your power rankings today, I think Buffalo still has to be number 1 in the AFC East because they were a legitimate Super Bowl contender last season and they've kept most of their roster. They have lost a few pieces. They replaced John Brown with Emmanuel Sanders. They've made a couple other sort of lower level moves, but most of their big questions have been answered this offseason. They're going to be fielding essentially the same team this season. So I do think that they're still the team to beat in the AFC, certainly, but I'd probably put the Patriots at number 2 right now, honestly, just because I think the quarterback situation in Miami still leaves a lot to be desired. Tua showed moments last season. I don't think he is a total lost cause. I think some people maybe are even a little bit too down on him after his rookie year, but he certainly didn't have a Justin Herbert type year or even a Kyler Murray type year the year before, somewhere where you can say, all right, this is the guy and he is going to be sort of that franchise quarterback for years to come. I still think there are a lot of question marks with him. And obviously that's a very important spot on the field for the Dolphins. And it has been kind of interesting to see how and I think Brian Flores is a very good coach down there, but some of the personnel moves that they've been making, the signing Kyle Van Noy and then cutting him after a year, there just seems to be a lot of instability, I guess you could call it, where it seems they've gone through, I think, 3 offensive coordinators already. There's just been a lot of moving pieces down there in Miami. And that obviously was a team that came very close to the playoffs last year. But I don't know. I think if even most of the Patriots free agent signings this year pan out and Cam Newton shows a moderate level of improvement, I think the Patriots can jump back over Miami into that second spot in the AFC East and maybe even give Buffalo a run. I mean, I think Buffalo is again going to be a Super Bowl contender this year, but I think I would put the Patriots at least in the conversation.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point about Miami. You know, everybody applauds the job that Brian Flores has done down there, but they've had a lot of turnover. And I'm glad you mentioned the Van Noy signing because that surprised me that they cut him. I know they gave him a lot of money, but it did surprise me that after 1 year they cut bait. They signed him, they signed a Landon Roberts, and it seems that obviously Flores has an affinity for former Patriots. They signed Adam Butler last week, but there has been instability there. And while he's done a good job turning that program around, if you will, it doesn't seem to be on steady ground, if you will. Final question here. Now, I think when you look at where the Patriots are right now and what they've done in the past week, how much of that do you think was a byproduct of Tom Brady winning a Super Bowl in Tampa Bay? Because there have been reports that internally that had nothing to do with it, that obviously they go 7-9, they looked at their roster, they had the cap space, they were motivated to spend. But we know for over 20 years, Bill Belichick didn't do this. There were a couple of occasions when he did do it, 03, 07, you mentioned 17 with Gilmore. But overall, he's kind of had a philosophy and he's stayed true to that philosophy. How much of what they've done in the past week do you think was motivated by Tom Brady winning a Super Bowl in Tampa, if it was a factor at all in the decisions that they've made thus far?
I honestly don't think it was much of a factor, if at all. Bill Belichick is a competitive guy. I'm sure that he was motivated by seeing Tom Brady win the Super Bowl to have an even stronger desire to go out and win one more of his own without Tom Brady. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Patriots had this type of offseason mapped out in week 15, week 16, even before the regular season ended. I think it was pretty clear by the end of the year what their needs were and what the areas they were going to have to improve for this coming season were. And I don't have inside info on this, but I would be reasonably confident that the Patriots had this plan in mind even before Tom Brady went out and won the Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Bucks. I think it's much more of a product of the Patriots going 7-9 than Tom Brady winning the Super Bowl. I think if the Patriots were far more competitive this year, if they went 13-3 and lost in the AFC Championship game or something like that, and then Tom Brady won the Super Bowl, I certainly don't think you would have seen this level of off-season spending. So I think it was much more inwardly focused. Just Bill Belichick realizing that the roster that they played with last season was just not good enough to compete at a high level in the NFL, and then them having the resources necessary to go out and very quickly address that. Because I definitely don't think that this is a team and an organization that is interested at all in a multi-year rebuild. I mean, they want to be back competing for championships this season. Now, whether that's going to happen remains to be seen. As I said, I wouldn't peg them as Super Bowl contenders right now, but I think this is all based on Bill Belichick wanting to get this team back to where it has been before when it did have Tom Brady. But I don't think Brady's success outside of New England really was much of a factor into that, if it was a factor at all.
I don't know. I tend to agree with you. I don't think from a business perspective they would look at it that way, but you'd have to think, and it's human nature, right, that it probably chapping him is probably not the right way to word what I'm trying to say, but it probably bothered him a little bit that it tapped into his competitiveness, and he said, you know what? We really need to execute this plan. I agree with you. I think that this plan was in motion prior to the end of last season. I think they knew where they were going to be. They knew they had done the math on the opt-outs coming back, and I think that they felt pretty confident that they can take advantage of what was a depressed market. I mean, the truth of the matter is it all ended up timing out pretty good for them because you had a lot of teams that had cap problems, New Orleans, Green Bay, a lot of teams that would normally spend, like a Baltimore, that really didn't. And so the Patriots were in a prime position with their cap space to spend, because even teams that had more cap space than them, a team like the Colts, they have so many of their own guys to re-sign that they weren't really going to be willing to use that cap space. Plus, Chris Ballard, their GM, hasn't really done that. But by and large, I do agree with you. But there is a small part of me that thinks that that might have, if there was any hesitation to do what they did, him winning it might have been that final, if that makes any sense. And that might have been the final push that they needed to say, hey, we got to move forward with this plan. Well, Zack, I want to say thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. I really appreciate it, man. It's great to see you. Please give your family my best wishes, and let's do this again soon.
Thanks, Zack.
Absolutely. Yeah, guys, I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. Hopefully KP can keep up the success that they've had literally every single year since I left. I mean, we never won more than 3 games when I was there. And then they were like 10-0 and winning state championship games literally the year that I left. So I like to think that we laid the foundation for what is now basically one of the best high school programs in the state. But that probably wasn't actually true, but it'll make me feel better about myself. Yeah. All right.
No, you guys absolutely did, because you know what? And you know that you've been around football for a long time, Zack. It takes buy-in, and you guys bought in and believed in what Coach Lee and the staff were selling, and you did lay the foundation, and now that carries over to these teams that we've had in recent years and this year's team, and now they know about Warrior pride and the Warrior way, and that's because you guys laid that foundation with your buy-in. But it's good seeing you. It's good talking to you, and like I said, let's do this again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Zack. All right, that'll do it for this week's show. Again, we'll join you next week. For Kevin Stone, I'm John Sarnitas. Until then, peace.
See ya.